Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming along to today's APS HR Network event. My name is Rachel Mosley. I'm the Assistant Secretary of Staffing Branch here at DFAT, and it's my pleasure to be your MC today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to welcome all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are here with us today, both in Canberra and also at sites all over Australia. We're live streaming and recording today's discussion with our panellists, John Scriven, Catherine McLennan and Jackie Curtis, who I will introduce in just a moment. We want to encourage everyone to participate today, and you can do that via your smart devices by using the online Q&A. And there'll be people in the room that will be passing you those questions throughout the event. After the event, we will be making the video recording available on GovTeams. So if you're not yet registered on GovTeams, please do so, and encourage your colleagues to do that too, so we can start to build that community. In terms of the format of today's event, I'll ask Jackie Curtis, Head of HR Profession and Chief Operating Officer at the Australian Taxation Office, to make some opening remarks. Then we'll move to our panel discussion. Then we'll have 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. And then I'll invite you all here in Canberra to join us for some afternoon tea. And I understand that there'll be similar events happening all over Australia. So, Jackie, please.
Well, good afternoon everyone, and thank you Rachel for that warm welcome and welcoming us here in Canberra to the Diplomatic Academy, which is a new experience for me and I'm sure for many of you as well. It's wonderful to see so many of our HR professional colleagues here today. I would particularly like to welcome some special guests, Carmel McGregor from ARI and Kim Schofield, also from ARI, our professional association, Sunny Hudson from IPA, another very important association for public servants, some of my COO colleagues, Justine Grieg, Marcus Markovic, and many other of the SES colleagues from within the service across Australia. And also, and most importantly, all of you here in Canberra and across the country. I understand we have hundreds of people joining us across the country via live stream and joining together afterwards for networking events hosted by different agencies. It's wonderful to see everyone getting behind the professional stream and coming together to build our capability, boost our standing as a profession, and our ability to contribute to, shape and influence outcomes in our respective organisations. In particular though, I'd like to thank our DFAT colleagues, Penny Williams, Chief Operating Officer here at DFAT, and Rachel Mosley, who you just met, who's just one of a terrific people leadership team here at Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are sponsoring the event and making everything possible, including the live stream technology, which I have been assured is working everywhere throughout the country. So thank you so much, DFAT. Now, today's theme is strategic HR. And if any of you have read any of my recent LinkedIn articles, you'll know that that's a theme I'm particularly focused on. I think it's a key part of the work that we do as HR professionals, but it's also a space where we have a lot of room to improve and where we can have more impact. Even within our own professions, we sometimes fail to recognise that the important role we can play in shaping corporate strategy and influencing the direction of our organisations. By way of example, I was recently talking to a colleague and a friend of mine who is a fellow government HR leader. She is a brilliant HR professional at the top of her game. So I was eager to have a discussion with her and get her perspectives on strategic HR. She shared with me how she'd been getting to know the core business of her agency and the corporate direction of the new role that she was in. She was thinking deeply about how she could improve HR practices and was developing some clever strategies to deliver on business objectives, all of which is great and directionally on point. Indeed, if you Google strategic HR, you will see that that's exactly what the literature says, that it's best practice for strategic HR to enable and support corporate strategy. It's hard to argue against that, but to my mind, What we have to offer as HR professionals goes beyond supporting corporate strategy, or at least it could do. You see, what struck me about my colleague's case when she was talking to me, she was doing great work, there was no doubt about it. And as I heard her talk, I realised that she was responding effectively to her agency's corporate strategy. However, it was always after the fact. No one was involving her or the HR experts that she represented in the development of the corporate strategy. In other words, the people aspect was perhaps a secondary consideration. This story is all too common, and it's the organisations and our people that miss out. HR insights and expertise, when properly incorporated into the strategy development process, can help us ensure that corporate direction is sustainable, meaningful, and able to be executed. HR and business need to have a two-way relationship. It's not about the executive dictating priorities for HR to then deliver on, but rather HR helping to shape those priorities in the first place. In an era when manufacturing has given way to an economy driven by services and knowledges, and the customer experience at the centre of everything that we do, the people perspective and the approaches that HR bring to the table is more important than ever. After all, you can have the best plans, policies, practices, and strategies, but it is our people that bring all of these to life. So how can we change this dynamic? How do we position strategic HR as a critical input to the organisational direction setting and planning? And do we all agree what strategic HR even looks like? That's why we're here today, to provide some inspiration as well as practical advice and insights into the challenge. We have two excellent panellists joining us who'll be sharing their experiences and strategic insights into HR in action. So I will let Rachel introduce them in just a moment. I personally am very much looking forward to hearing from the two special guests we have here today, their perspectives on the challenge of strategic HR and how we can address this. So thanks once again for attending today, and without further ado, I'll ask Rachel to come back and introduce our guests. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce John Scriven today, who is the Deputy Chairman of the Board for the Australian Human Resources Institute, or AHRI. John has a wealth of HR experience across multiple industries, most recently as Group Executive for People at Qantas. John retired from executive work in December 2017, and he now serves on the board of AHRI and continues to coach and mentor executives. Please welcome John. Next is Catherine McLennan. Catherine is an executive coach for leaders from public, private and not-for-profit organisations, where she focuses on corporate strategy, talent and psychology. She was previously Global Senior Vice President of People and Culture at Cochlear and has held executive HR roles at QBE and Commonwealth Bank. Her most recent role was Head of Strategy and HR for the federal agency Export Finance Australia. Please welcome Catherine. And I'd like to welcome Jackie Curtis back onto the stage. As I mentioned, Jackie's the Head of HR Profession across the APS. She's currently the COO of ATO. She's on the Australian Human Resources Institute as a fellow and has been appointed recently as adjunct professor at the University of Canberra. So welcome back, Jackie. For those of you who attended the launch of the APS HR Professional Stream strategy late last year, you would have heard Peter Woolcott, the APS Commissioner, reflect on the changes and challenges facing the APS, which have informed the development and launch of that strategy. Its purpose is to build and uplift strategic HR skills across the APS, which brings us to the theme of today's panel event, what is strategic HR? So we'll now move to have our panel discussion, and I'm going to pose my first question to John. John, from your perspective, what does strategic HR mean?
When I tell on a piece of string, I'll start with what it just definitely isn't, right? And in order for organisations to work, there's a huge amount of administration that is just necessary, whether it's in finance, in HR, etc. And in HR, we have a whole bunch of compliance roles that we have to play as administrative. And strategic HR isn't that work, right? There are many, many definitions. The one that I've always been attracted to is one which is around helping to address and solve business problems with a long-term view of improving business performance. So I like the fact it's attached to problems because it actually gives some clues as to how to go about your work. Picking up some of the earlier comments, at its best, it is being part of a team, right, which is looking at what the future direction should be. And in the same way that you don't separate the finance stream, you don't separate the marketing stream, you're talking about what the problems are of the organisation and what the plan should be. Yeah. At its minimum, it is taking the business plan as it is and then shaping out of that what are all of the initiatives that are actually going to help deliver that. So, but so much of it is how you go about your work, right? If you take the problem focus, it does mean that your conversation with an executive is about what are the issues that you're facing, because it's not just one. It's not just one strategic plan. It's a way of actually going about your work.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to add anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about the balance between problem solving and strategic thinking. It's a very difficult balance to strike, and we'll probably talk about that in a little while, because there's so many different demands of your business partners. First, they want you go and solve an employee case, and then they want you to predict the future capability for the next 10 years. And I think that's one of the interesting challenges. And actually, as you know, both of those spectrum requires different skills and different mindsets. So how do you manage a team that can actually play across the spectrum? And I would echo that.
Thank you. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about the future of work, including the impact of technological change that we see in our workplaces, and it's driving then changes to business and operating models and also large-scale organisational transformation. John, could I put this question to you? The HR function was a key player in supporting the delivery of a significant transformation at that company, and I understand it was recognised by ARI, and you won HR Team of the Year in 2015. Could you tell us a little bit more about how HR helped turn Qantas around, both financially but also in terms of reputation as an employer?
Yes, I can. That's probably less about the future of work, because it's fair to say that the future of work wasn't on many of our minds at the time, because I joined in early 2009. Alan was in the chair at late 2008. We just had the financial crisis, SARS had happened, and when those two events happened, the aviation industry had only just recovered from 9/11. So we were in a position, and as I say, when we talk about problems, right, the problems that the organisation had was we had a cost base that was 40% higher than Virgin's. Our customer service was patchy at best. Sometimes it was fantastic, and sometimes it was awful. And we had an employee group who was pretty disengaged. Some of you remember there was an engineer strike in 2008. So that dragged our customers through hell for a period of time. That was resolved, much to the delight of the engineers, who actually got probably a better deal than they thought they were going to get. But that seriously caused problems with other employee groups. And so we had an organisation, right, which was actually, I'd suggest, not functioning very well. We'd also committed to buying, if I remember the chart, in terms of aircraft purchases, it was $3 billion the next year, $4 billion the year after, $5 billion the year after, $3 billion. Now, put that in the context of an organisation that was making 400 million. So that was the backdrop. And so in terms of setting a strategy, and the strategy continued for 10 years, and there are changes, things happen, so you've got to make. But in essence, when we sat round the table to say, what do we need to do over the next 5 years? The plan that was put together, one of the core ingredients of it was actually fundamentally changing the culture of the organisation. The organisation had had a top-down management style, which meant we had a whole bunch of very smart people waiting to be told what to do. We had a whole bunch of managers further down managing the front line who were terrified of making their own decisions. So when you've got a 33,000 person organisation, it's very difficult to run it if you haven't got people able to make decisions themselves. So integral to the whole plan, and there were massive cost programs out, there were customer service outcomes. But one of the core things in order to make sure that we could take cost out, that we could improve customer, was actually fundamentally changing the way our leaders worked. And so we went about a leader-led cultural change program, which continued for, I was there for 9 and a bit years. We had meetings with our senior 100 every 8 to 12 weeks. Alan Joyce and the executive team never missed a minute of any of those meetings. So Alan didn't just turn up and open it and then wander off to go and do more important things. What he did was remain there, because getting the alignment of all of those executives, getting the expectations of what they needed to do as leaders was going to be critical. So that was the core of it. We had to do lots of measurement. We had to do lots of frontline leader training to help with our employees to just get themselves re-engaged with the organisation. And that was done through, we talk about the HR team, but I think when you get these strategies done right, it's not the HR team doing it, it's every leader in the organisation recognises that their role encompasses the culture, their own personal behaviour in how they go about doing things. And that, if you like, was at the heart of the change for the organisation. And we had to close things, we had to do all sorts of things. But right at the core of the strategy was how people work together, how they collaborate, how you lead, how you allow people to make decisions, how you do delegate appropriately, how do you help somebody at the front line be able to make a decision on the spur of the moment when faced with a customer. Right? So that was the work, I remember when I first started with Alan said, so how long is this going to take, John? And like all CEOs, 3-year cycles are typically, right, the way things are viewed. So I said, well, I reckon after 10 years, Alan. I rank 10 years, and I think we will have a fundamentally different culture. But after 5, you ought to be able to see a tangible difference. But it doesn't mean it can't revert. Whereas after 10 years, and some stuff's just happened at Qantas recently, and I think it shows actually that the culture remains strong in the organisation.
You mentioned measurement. Presumably you were able to track that improvement in terms of employee satisfaction and so forth through surveys, but you definitely saw an uptick in terms of employee engagement.
The core metrics, and in an airline, let me assure you, there's so many things that are measured, but actually the core measures that we used around the transformation was, first of all, profile of our leaders. We used LSI as a proxy for constructive leadership. Were they getting more blue or not, right? And anyone who knows the tool. So that's pretty crude. Our net promoter score, because we know that if everything's happening from the senior leaders down to the front line, the outcomes for the customer should be better. Right, so that's critical. And then we did use engagement surveys. And over the 9 years, we had 1 year where Hewitt's, whose survey we used, said they had never seen an organisation of our size and our complexity with such a large increase. And it was something like 8% over the year, which is, most people, if you can get 1 or 2% each year, it's good. And we had an 8% improvement. And every measure we had increases until we actually hit above Australian norms, which was our global best practice remains a dream, I'm sure there, but Australian norm is what we want. Yeah.
And if I might just follow up again, in terms of your senior leadership, did you see, the leadership cohort extremely engaged and sort of participate fully in that journey?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who say, well, that's not the way I've managed and that's not the way I'm going to do it. But we still measured their LSI. We set expectations that their engagement scores needed to grow and that their personal, the way that they went about leaders needed to change. And so they had decisions to make themselves. And so we had a whole bunch who were saying about time, because all they saw was upside for themselves, because they want to make decisions, right? You can't take 5 billion out of an organisation, right, which is, I think, what we did over the 10 years, without all sorts of people contributing. It can't just be a couple of people saying, let's close this big engineering centre. It's got to be cost at all levels. So those leaders who embraced it, and of course, when you get them together every 2 months and talk about some of the successes, those who aren't on board, some of them actually go, actually, maybe I ought to be trying, and others go, I still can't do it. I think there's all sorts of reasons why people leave organisations, but I think when I left, of the 100 who were sitting in front of us, and by the way, there were 2 women, I think, in that group, but by the time we'd finished, right, we had 36 out of the 100 were women. But of the 100, I think 41 remained in the organisation from that first, and others had taken opportunities, either for new opportunities or go into a culture which suited them more. We did lose some to banks, so... Maybe we need to edit that one out.
Thank you. Catherine, I might turn to you now. While at Cochlear, you led a talent transformation program, I understand, across 20 countries. Could you tell us a little bit about that, the drivers for transformation, and how strategic HR played a role in delivering that program of work?
Sure. I mean, Cochlear is an interesting company to look at. It always has been for Australia. Maybe not as interesting. I don't know. It can be equal to Qantas. And for those of you who've looked at the 4 industrial revolutions, we tried to move. We're in the process of moving from the third, which is all about automation, manufacturing, using IT, to the 4th, which is about the integration of the physical, the data, and the biological. And that's what we're interested in when we look at the robotic HR frontier. So all of a sudden, we were trying to move a primarily manufacturing and distribution company that was all different countries that really could have been their own distribution companies. You know, there wasn't any integration across the world. We didn't have a similar culture. We didn't understand how to deploy digital. We were totally reliant on distributors to get to our customer. And all of a sudden, the thing of Internet of Things started to come along. Artificial intelligence started to come along. And we needed to be quickly up the chain to understand how we were going to deploy that and get into the 4th Industrial Revolution and start integrating us as one global culture with global functions, with a way of understanding each other. And it was fascinating, and it still is. I mean, it's in process because nobody actually knows what this 4th industrial age will be comprised of. So working with the CEO as basically a jousting partner, not only were we driving people and culture, but we were leading the strategy. You know, so that was a really, really important moment, and that's what the CEO was looking at. I was saying to John, there's not many CEOs that get that talent is the main driver of this new age, because it's all about creator ideas. It's not about knowledge like the previous age. It's not about industrial capital in plants, but it's really about talent and really understanding fundamentally how to leverage that talent to deliver this very new strategy. So they're in process now, and it was just delightful to be part of that kind of a rising of the 4th industrial age.
And in terms of your talent, did you find that you needed to attract talent from outside your organisation, as well as, build existing, the talent of existing colleagues within the company? What was that balance like?
Sure. I mean, if I kept it simple, in the third industrial age, we were primarily R&D, we were manufacturing, we were distributors and sales. So, you know, a fairly typical vanilla type organization of that industry that could automate a little bit. But as we're entering the fourth, all of a sudden, we need to know how to get to that customer directly. We actually don't need distributors anymore, and the customer is N=1. So you've got to deliver products that are ready to go, that are constantly being adapted. And we understand each and every one of those customers. We just don't understand our distributors like the doctors and the hospitals. We understand each of those customers. And they're using biological processes to monitor, in this case, their hearing, but ResMed's just there. In fact, ResMed, don't quote me, but I think is well ahead of Cochlear in understanding how to get to that N=1, to understand biological processes that are feeding back to the headquarters and how to constantly adjust that. That is a whole different type of talent. And we spent a lot of time in Seattle and San Francisco to find these guys. They're not a huge number of people in Australia yet, you know, that really look at that. We had to find cutting edge integration and do partnerships and everything else. So, you know, employees were sometimes employees, they were sometimes contractors, they were sometimes part of our partnership, and it became a very complex network. So that gives you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, I might pose this question to you first. In terms of transformation programs that you've been involved in, they have the potential to destabilise staff, the business, the customer, as you mentioned before. When you've navigated this in your role, how have you been able to strike the balance between keeping the day-to-day operations going and really leading change? I'm sure this is relevant for a number of colleagues also within the APS who are undergoing or sort of part of transformation programs. How do you manage the day-to-day and lead change?
Yeah. I think there's a scale of change where you can't do both. Right? You need to put separate teams aside who need to go do the stuff. Closing an engineering, big engineering, we did close 2 of them, both in Victoria, with huge consequences for Victoria and huge consequences for those employees. To try and manage that in anything other than putting complete resources there in order to make sure that the business continues, because you've got to transfer some of those functions elsewhere, but also to make sure that those employees are given the best opportunity, right, for re-employment. Because if you've been in engineering Qantas for 35 years, let me tell you, you don't think you can do anything other than fix Qantas aircraft. Whereas the skills that they've got are extraordinary. But actually you've got to do a huge amount of work with them, right, over weeks and months in order to help them realise that, because only then are they ready to go out and look for work. So we needed separate teams. But on the other side of it, one of the things we said to all of our leaders, and Qantas is run by about 100 people, and then there's another 400 managers, right? And that we trained every single one of those in change management, in how to go about change, on the basis that they had to make changes in their own workplace. I mean, we wanted them to challenge everything that was happening in their patches with a view to doing 2 things. One, take cost out, and secondly, increase customer outcomes. Right? And most people go, oh, surely it's either or. Well, and the answer is no, it's not. There are many ways that you can improve customer outcomes, right, and reduce costs. So there were ongoing change, right, and so we would have 1 or 2 people in those businesses responsible for coordinating change. But what we said to people was, actually, it's part of your job, right? And it's just another project that needs to be done along with managing your passengers, etc. So for me, training them is a very important part, because if you don't train them, it's a lottery. A good leader will, even if not untrained, will do the right thing, and somebody who's only average, right, might well screw it all up. So you're better off training them all, having your own frameworks, your own set of tools, etc., and employ some specialist change managers, right, to actually lubricate the wheels, if you like. So,
Thank you. Was that your experience too, Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a transformation, what's the most interesting role for, I forget this, what's the most interesting role for us, I think, I kind of came in as choreographer. What does that mean? It means that the most, the rarest or the most limited thing we have is the time of talent. And so part of what I thought was the number one responsibility was making sure all year long, wherever we met, whether it was 2 people, an executive team, a middle management team, a large forum like this for 3 days, the global coming together. We spent a ton of time, Qantas would be glad to know, flying executives around. Sure, we use video, but we really believed in bringing the global teams together constantly. And how do you transform a company like that? You have to do it through people exchange. And people have to feel empowered to understand how that's going to work. And what the 4th industrial age for me is about the creator leader, whereas perhaps the 3rd was about the knowledge leader. And so it's interesting to see for John, how did you transform those engineers so that not only were they delivering the knowledge and expertise to Qantas, but they're now trying to create the future. That's a really interesting transformation for us.
Thank you. Jackie, we might bring you in at this point to talk about transformation across the APS. We recently saw the independent review of the APS make a number of recommendations about how the APS can improve into the future, and there's a lot in there for us as HR professionals, whether it be recommendations relating to capability or recruitment or talent management or performance management. So from your perspective, what advice can you give APS HR professionals as to how to prepare for what's coming and how to implement that reform piece?
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for a question about the whole of the APS and not tax, because after Qantas and Cochlear, it would be a little bit less exciting, I think. But the APS question is good. Look, I think the first thing HR professionals need to do is actually understand what is in that review and read it. And I think it's a mammoth a lot of paperwork to get through, and there's a lot to read, but unless you've actually got your head around what's in there and what the recommendations are and how they all fit together, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to assist and influence and help shape how to actually make that real to the APS. I think that's the number one thing. I think the second thing is to think about, when you look at all of that, it could be very daunting to think, well, how are we going to cover all of those recommendations? And there is quite a lot to it. I would say, though, that most of the recommendations that we can shape and influence that are, within the bounds of the HR profession to have a role in are things that really we should be doing anyway. So when you look at some of the stuff around capability development, workforce planning, etc., it's not really something that we needed to have called out. We really should have been on the front foot with this. So I think when you look at it, you could go, wow, there's so much there. But I would be looking at it and picking, where is it that we can have the most impact? And in particular, with any change program, it's important to get some quick wins and to be able to celebrate those successes so that people really can see that you mean business. And I think within the APS review, there are some opportunities to really say, yep, we could do that quite quickly and quite easily, and it would signal that we mean business. So I know, for example, at the moment, the APSC with some of the deputies are looking at a whole of government graduate program, because it would be easier for us and for the applicants in particular to apply. I think that's a solid project and would have a really big impact. However, it's fraught with politics and sensitivities, because agencies like to have their own grad programs. That's why we've got what we've got. So, something that might be a little bit more simple and easy to tackle would be the temp registers, for example. Temp registers, they tend to be for sort of a more junior level staff. Many agencies have 1, 2. In tax, we have 3 temp registers, all of which you have to say something quite different in your application for. Surely that's something we could tackle quickly and easily, and says to the whole of the workforce, actually we mean business here. And I think there are a number of things within the APS review where HR professionals could literally get in there now and start doing it, and they don't really need to have a lot of permission from the top. They can just do that. And the third area, I think, is culture. I think there's a huge role for the profession to play in helping to shape the culture that we need for the future. And I think there are many levers that we have. The very obvious ones, leadership, that John's talked about, rewards and recognition, performance management. You know, they're our core business. We should be all over those and using those to actually help shape culture. But there are other tools, other levers that we have in our space that we can use that would actually have a significant impact on culture, and we should be considering those as well. So, you know, in our space, in people, measurement. You know, are we measuring things that are really going to help shift the culture, or are we measuring things that actually reinforce the culture that we have? So I think those are the areas where we can play and have the most influence in helping to bring about change.
Okay, thank you. The examples that you have all shared today suggest, you know, again, that there's real value and benefit of HR being at the sort of top table. And one of the questions that was posed at the last event that we didn't get to was, how do you actually get HR there? How do you get that seat at the table? You've all played senior leadership roles and you've managed that. So if any of you are able to reflect on how you did that, or indeed, you know, times when that's been challenging and how you've navigated that.
I might start because
Yeah.
I have the microphone. That's always an advantage. Well, I've been very fortunate to have some incredible leaders. Maybe I've chosen them, I'm not sure, but maybe I've just been fortunate. One of them here, Carmel, who's always been committed to HR, but my boss, Chris Jordan, I've told you the story of that before, Linnell Briggs, loads of people I've worked for that have actually been committed to having HR at the executive table and have seen the value of what we can do. But I think that's not always the case. We all know that. And if it was, we wouldn't be saying we need a seat at the table. There's a couple of things that stand out for me. One is I do feel that HR professionals need to really get out and understand more about the business and what makes it tick. And I think there's sort of like this passive acceptance sometimes. You go along to a meeting and it's all about the business, and then at the end you might go, oh, what's the HR perspective on this? Or you get asked a people question. I think one of the things you can do is actually start asking questions about the business when you're at those meetings. I mean, the people in other functions have no qualms about asking us about what we do in HR and querying it and questioning it and challenging us. We should start challenging them on their business strategy and asking questions about what are their challenges, what are the opportunities, the risks, because that will help us to engage with them and also show that when we do say something, we're bringing it to the table, having considered what the business implications are. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing we need to do is just have a little bit more confidence. I know it's hard sometimes, but actually I do think when people speak up and bring their expertise, that's exactly what the people around that table, the rest of the exec, are looking for. They want your view, they want you to constructively challenge, and they want you to back it up with evidence. Where is the evidence for what you're saying, and whether you're drawing on best practice research or data or whatever you've got that can make the case, that's what we need to use to have more voice and more influence. And I think the seat at the table then just becomes an automatic thing.
I just love looking at the evolution of our function. And again, you can use the 4 industrial ages to look at it, because in the first one, when it was just all about setting up factories, we didn't exist, right? In fact, people weren't even people. They were just people to man the machines. And when you get to the second industrial age, where we start looking at how do you set up, not automation, but the processes of working with electricity and working with steel and working with all that productivity, you know, we started to go from personnel managers. You know, we became the admin person that sort of sat at the back of the office, and people just sort of knew that we were there to kind of hire people and fire people probably. But when the third industrial age came around the 60s, and we began to see the importance of IT and automation and everything else like that, we went through a quick evolution. I mean, we went from order taking, and then we went to specialist, and we started to see the centers of expertise, and we started to be valued by the business as having that particular expertise, but we weren't too good at integrating it and applying it against business strategy. To nowadays, at the end of the third industrial age, being equivalent to what Jackie was describing, becoming the business partner, really fundamentally understanding business strategy and business economics, and being able to get into the room even at that stage. And whilst we get the seat at the table, we're still seen as, the head of people, the head of talent, the head of culture, which is great because the name's changed, from FTE to human resources to human capital. And now we're you see a whole plethora of names like people and culture and talents, chief talent officers is becoming that. But in this new age, it becomes even more interesting because while sitting at the table and just being the HR person and being a really good business partner, this next stage is we're going to be driving the strategy. Talent is going to drive where that business invests. That's going to be the primary driver. And so all of a sudden, we're at the table driving the strategy. And I'd like to, I'm just going to hire a book, which I just love. It's a book that had to be written called Talent Wins. And I think it's funny that Ram Charan, of course, was involved. He wrote Leadership Pipeline. But Dominic Barton co-authored it, who's the global head of McKinsey. And Dennis Carey, who's the VP of the Global Korn Ferry, wrote this book, came out last year. And basically, they're saying talent trumps strategy, which I think is, yay. And they think that the HR manager, now called Chief Talent Officer, should be paid equally to the CFO. And no longer is the key partner for the CEO either the CFO, and then it eventually became the CIO, and eventually became the strategist. Talent is. And that's who the person that the CEO spends the most time with, because talent's critical to the growth of the company. And so it's very interesting to watch that conversion of the seat at the table. Most organizations I work with are a long way away, and most CEOs are a long way away. They're still kind of in the third industrial age and don't fundamentally understand what talent looks like.
Thank you.
I wouldn't mind just adding a couple. I think there's one other dimension, I think, in this, which is there's a mindset. When you sit round whatever team, you've got your boss there and you've got your peers, the first thing you should be thinking about is, this is my first team, right? Not my HR team. This is my first team. And I am an equal participant in that team. Right? We all play different roles, but it's a really important mindset because it allows you to approach discussions in a different way. Now, it means you've got to understand the business that you're part of. You've got to understand the problems a business faces. You've got to understand the issues your colleagues face. There's a whole range of things you've got to understand in order to be a value contributor. And if in that you now become a value contributor, right, you've got your seat at the table. So for me, there's something about demand it if you want, earn it, I'd suggest is the best way. And, inevitably, being from RA, I have to talk about, the sort of certification. But if you look at the personal qualities that you're looking at in order to be a successful HR, they are credible, courageous, critical inquiring thinker, solution-driven, future-oriented influencer, right? Doesn't say nice person. No, hopefully, if you're one of those as well, that's really nice.
Goodness for that.
But if you think about those adjectives and how you bring that into a discussion, that's how I think that you earn your place. And increasingly, you're going to be asked to. So you need to be up for it because, to the point, who you've got in your organisation, right, is going forward going to be way more important, right, than what you do. Because they will help determine it. Because the future of work, we can all try and predict it. And one thing I guarantee was everyone, I think I'm on my 5th version of it now, future of work. we go back to horses. 1920, America had 25 million horses. There's only a couple of million there now. So there's a lot of cowboys going, what's my job going to be? Yeah, and so your talent and the agility, your flexibility to respond to things, that's what's going to make the difference going forward. Because that allows you to always be ready for when something happens, and when it happens, it's probably not what you were expecting it to be.
Thanks, John. I mean, you're obviously, all of you senior leaders at the table, influencing, being part of forming strategy for your organisations. But for a lot of the colleagues that are tuning in, perhaps at the more junior or even middle management sort of stage of their career, what can they do to best support that effort, but also be more strategic in their own day-to-day work? How do they fit in to that scenario that you've just painted for us? Yeah.
At Qantas, I had a routine, which was I met with every one of my colleagues every month and didn't talk to them about what was on my plate. I talked to them about how their business was going, what are the issues they've got, talk about some of the people issues they've got, talk about their own, and also talk about some of their own aspirations as well. But what you're doing there is trying to understand what's on their plate, and if you can say what's the problem that you're facing, that is being strategic. Mm-hmm. As soon as you come back with what about if we tried to do this, now you're being strategic. Strategy is not left for the people at the top. Alan Joyce, I'm sure, would tell you, right, that 90% of his job is the drudge that all of us have to do, right? There's 10%, 20%, right, which is around really sort of making a difference. Now, what I encourage everybody to do is to say, what's the problem, right? And if strategic HR is taking a problem, trying to fix it, right, using the tools at your disposal, you're being strategic there. So that's what I would do. And the more you do that, the more wins you get on the board, the more you get engaged with your team, your colleagues. And that's why the certification journey is structured the way that it is. Right? The case study at the end is to take a business problem, right, that you've faced, and how do you fix it? It's trying to rewire, right, that it's not about, I think you used the word, dictating what needs to be done. When somebody tells you what they want done, I want to have this done, what's the first thing you want to do? If you want to be strategic, you say, what's the problem you're trying to fix? Now you go back to root problem, and that's a way of really, now you'll get some really rich conversations, right? So that's what I'd encourage you to do. So certification and ask a lot of questions, right?
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I love what John had to say, because again, like right at the end of where we've been is HR being at the table and really fundamentally understanding business strategy. You've got to spend time really understanding the business and really understanding the customers. Spend as much time as you can with the front line and your customers so that you understand the business. It's because that's going to drive your talent approach. Now, in this new age that's arising, it's reverse, because talent's going to drive strategy. So not only do you have to fundamentally understand how that works, you've got to be leading the executive discussion. And then secondly, you've really got to understand how talent expands its ability. And these days we have a term called vertical development. You might have heard of Robert Keegan, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, my teacher is Terry O'Fallon. But fundamentally, as we hit this age, we all know we need to develop way past the expert that you usually find in corporate, even way past the strategist, but we need to actually understand fundamentally a huge capacity of humans to take change in the way it's doing. And so, being fundamentally interested, which is why we're seeing the neuroscience, which is why we're seeing, HR as psychotherapist, which is why we're looking at the human potential, because we fundamentally have to understand that. And I guess the third thing I would say is, on behalf of Ari, is that we have to know how to develop ourselves. We have to spend every day figuring out how we get that strategy outlook, how we understand human potential, how we get that seat at the table. And that doesn't come just by doing an HR degree, as good as it is. I'm affiliated with UTS. So it doesn't just come with the specialist degrees that we have. It comes from a whole plethora of understanding business strategy, understanding psychology, understanding marketing, understanding finance, big time. And so we've got to develop ourselves to be, multifaceted, and that's going to be difficult.
I'd like to just give an example because one of our HR managers at Qantas, and one of the things was trying to fix was this frontline customer service, right, particularly in the air. Right? How can you get a much more consistent? So there was a big strategy was put together. It involved technology so that everyone knew who was on the plane. It involved introducing MPS and managing every micro element of the journey. But there was an element of training. Right. And so our HR manager started digging into what the problem was, and we actually had some workshops with customers, etc. And it was interesting because it wasn't that our front line didn't know how to serve customers. It was all about attitude. And so that took us then, the training ended up being something very, very different than was envisaged at the beginning. And that's because you've tried to really dig down into what the problem was. And I'll tell you the solution because essentially, I'm making this very simplistic, but we said that there are red days and there are black days. A red day is a Qantas day when you wake up and you go, I cannot wait to get onto that plane. I cannot wait to meet the customers of the day. And a black day was one when you wake up and you go, I really don't want to go to work. But the labelling of these things, because obviously we said, what does everyone want? They want everyone. Doesn't matter whether you woke up red or black, you've got to be red. Customers, are they red or black? Yeah, they can be either, right, as well. But how do you be? And what we ended up with was this fascinating self-correction model on the plane, where somebody would say, you seem to be having a black day. It's depersonalized, completely depersonalized. It's language everyone accepts. And somebody goes, oh yeah. Right? And you go, it's really simple. The difference it made to our NPS scores, right, were staggering. And it allowed the young to pick up, because some of the attitude problems was, I don't want to be ageist, but it was related to some of our longer serving crew members. But there was a way of dealing with it on board. And so for me, that was a real success for that HR manager, right? Not just trotting out, I want a training program, so let's go do it. But actually, let's really dig deep into this and understand what it is, because it ended up not being a training program. It was something very, very different.
Anything you'd like to add at that point?
Well, I suppose the thing that I just wanted to add, and it's not to be negative, but I think it's a really important consideration, and I think we need to factor in when we're listening to feedback from in the public service secretaries and our deputies and people that are sort of on the receiving end of our services, is in order to be able to play this role, we also need to make sure that we absolutely get the basics right. And part of the feedback that we've had in the HR profession is that until we can do that, why would we listen to anything that's more strategic or more, out there, really? So I just think that it's all about making sure, and this is where the qualifications, the accreditation, this is why it is so important, because when you look at some of the other professional streams, they've really put a focus on being able to give that level of comfort, not just by providing excellent foundation services, but also by signalling that they have those credentials through their professional accreditation, through their professional memberships, etc. And they hold that really dearly to them. If you talk to people in the legal profession or finance profession, etc., they really do. They put a lot of weight on the status of their professional qualifications, credibility, etc. And I think that is something that we haven't done so much in HR. And I think it is something that if we want to play this role, which I know that we do it, because why wouldn't you? It is so rewarding to be able to get there and help the business to not just solve challenges they have, but also identify some of the challenges that they've got coming up and how they might position themselves to be future-proofed. That's so much more exciting than just doing a straightforward recruitment process, right? So I think that we just need to have that in our minds and not get carried away with, well, we're going to be these super, people at the table actually shaping all the strategy. That would be lovely, but we've also got to ensure that we offer really good foundation services to get that confidence and trust, which is so important.
Can I just...
You're going to add to that.
An old boss of mine, he said, imagine going around to someone's house and they've just put a beautiful extension out the back, but when you walk in, the place is filthy, there's no washing up hasn't been done, all of the dirty clothes are on the floor. What do you think? No one cares about the extension, right? And he was using that, around, the fact that no matter how senior you get, there is detailed stuff that you have to get right. Right, and it doesn't change when you get more senior, right? It's just different. It's just different stuff. So getting that basics right is so important.
And that's been a real theme, Jackie, I think, for the work you've been leading across the APS, just acknowledging the fact that some agencies perhaps have a little way to go in terms of, instituting those systems and processes to ensure that we do have the staff with the skills to get those basics right, and supporting through training and accreditation and other things. And in terms of what DFAT's doing, you mentioned earlier, John, the importance of understanding the business. And so with the help of Lisa Arnold, who's leading our HR reform here at DFAT, we're going to be ensuring that our HR people are right out with the business, with their senior executives, with their deputy secretaries, understanding the needs of the business, and then shaping, the workforce planning, recruitment, and other things from there. So we might move now to involve other people in this conversation and move to a Q&A. And thank you so much to Jackie's team for providing this technology to me. They've been through the questions that have been coming in and have provided me with some to share. But I would also say, if there are colleagues without a smart device that would like to be part of the conversation, we can do it the old-fashioned way, and you can put your hand up, and I'm sure the panel will respond. So we might leap in. What can individual HR practitioners do in their agencies to be more strategic? Do you have some practical advice for us? So we've kind of gone to that question a little bit earlier in the panel, but in terms of some practical advice for colleagues, is there anything that the panel would like to add?
I think we have covered it pretty much, but I do feel that, we just need to be maybe a little bit braver, a little bit bolder. There's nothing wrong with suggesting something that's a bit out of the box and having a go. I think that, Catherine was saying about us being more creative and having to think outside the box in this new age that's coming. I absolutely think we are going to have to think differently about what we do, and that requires just a little bit of taking some risks and putting stuff on the table, and I don't think there's any harm in that. If you can have a culture where people are allowed to take risks and fail if things don't go right, well, that's really good. That's the only way we're going to actually really progress forward from where we are, not just in the HR profession but across the whole of the public service.
I think that's certainly relevant. Here at DFAT, we're trying recruitment slightly differently at the moment. We're moving from bulk recruitment to more targeted recruitment around capability streams. And we do need to be a little bit brave in trying something new. And that can be sometimes difficult when your critics are out there, the staff sort of monitoring how that unfolded and was it successful. But I do appreciate your comment there, Jackie, that we sometimes just need to take a leap of faith and try something new. And if it doesn't work, we can try something different.
I'd like to add one thing that maybe I'll just grab this microphone. Jeez, I'm never going to get that right. The other thing you can do is act as the educator for your organization as to what talent looks like. I remember when I was at CBA, one of the things I had to do, and you'll probably laugh at this, but okay, it was quite a few years ago. Ralph Norris was CEO, and I was sitting around the group executive, and I just had to explain succession planning. And, they were really interested in how it worked, because at that point, we didn't have a formal succession planning system. And so you'll laugh because we spent about 45 minutes deciding whether it should be a 9-box or a 4 box. You know, I mean, they're fascinated with the potential versus performance. So take the time to, you know, have confidence, like Jackie said, and be the educator for the people, because talent is really, really important. And most of our executives, you know, are from, it's not the information, I mean, the industrial age, a lot of the older ones, but they're from maybe the way of the digital. But you guys have the expertise, and your executives need to learn from you. So be bold.
I used to talk to the graduates at Qantas every year, right? And of course, the first thing they all want to be is strategists, right? But I said to them, look, the most important thing you can do in your first jobs is look at what the work you've been doing and find something that you believe can be done better. I said, that's being strategic, and just get in the habit of doing that all the time. Anyone in any organisation can do that. And that's the stuff which is being strategic, which actually builds confidence in others in terms of your capability. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. You've talked throughout the session today about the fourth industrial age, and we have a question from a colleague here. How should HR professionals prepare themselves for that fourth industrial age in terms of the core skills they need to build? Yeah. Perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, I have good news and I've got bad news. The bad news is that many of, at least the strategic top of the chain HR directors, are not going to come for traditional HR pathways. They are going to come from finance. They're going to come from strategy, particularly. They're going to come from marketing. And we're going to want multifaceted, you know, I was a strategist. That was my career. And then I was involved with the implementation of operations for the Olympics. So, you know, understanding these multifacets, that's the bad news. The good news is, as we formulate, you know, RA is a classic one, you know, as we formulate what the new chief talent officer looks like, you guys can learn. I mean, we're one of the best learners in the organization. We often act as plumbers and don't fix our own pipes. We got to stop doing that. We have to stop doing that. We have to invest in not only the HR processes and HR strategy, we have to invest in business strategy. We have to understand commerce. We have to understand marketing. And I love what John said. Well, how do you do that? Sure, you can do, okay, so you can go and do an MBA, whatever. But the best way to do it is invest time with the people that you're serving and working with. I shouldn't even say serving anymore, but people that you're working with. Spend time with the chief marketing officer. Spend time with the chief financial officer. And if you're at a certain level, just find the middle manager of finance. Sit down with her and figure out how her job works, and just be fundamentally curious. And you've got it, but we have to expand, not only in HR technical, we have to expand in all those fields. And so, you know, it'll be very interesting to see where the top of that, the HR, chief talent officer actually comes from. It can be one of you, but watch out, because the space is changing radically.
So colleagues that work in government agencies would like to take this opportunity to ask, what can they learn from the private sector? So what should we be trying to replicate and learn from companies like Qantas and Cochlear?
I actually think that change is good. I think there would be a perspective from outside the public service, right, that there's resistance to change, that you've got a bunch of different silos in within government, that the amount of inter-department activity is limited. And I'm probably quite wrong, so I'm just giving you here as someone who's really not, you know, I'm just an observer, if you like. And there are many businesses who are like that. The Qantas that I walked into was like that, and so for me the leadership role within the public service for getting more collaboration, right, escalation of problems. You know, the Qantas culture was escalating a problem was a bad thing. Look where it got the banks, right? Escalation, if you disagree with a colleague, right, and you can't come to... Escalation is a positive move, because if you make the assumption that you're both smart and you can't agree, well, that you want someone else in there with another perspective to help out there. So for me, it's that organisations where constructive leadership, collaboration, right, are the norm. That they are the successful private companies, right? And I would say that will be the same, right, within the private sector. Because I think at the end of the day, you've all got objectives. I think people can make a lot of up about the differences between the two. You've got big there are many outcomes that you get held accountable for. So I think there's a lot of baloney talked about the differences.
I might add something. In 2009, I met Jackie because I was asked by Linnell Briggs, who was CEO of the merged that coming together of Centrelink and Medicare, to ask to sit on the people committee of the organization. And when I put it to Ralph Norris, he goes, "Why would you want to spend any time in federal government?" And I was like, why wouldn't we? I mean, we have so much mutual learning. If you think about CBA's national network of branches, and then you think about Centrelink's national and Medicare's national branch of networks, I learned so much. In fact, I learned not only from what you guys were learning and what you guys were learning in a huge merger. We had a huge merger when we bought Bank West. I learned about just national networks and how to manage them culturally. And hopefully I shared some ideas. In fact, that was such a mutual learning experience. Be careful not to say that it's only one way. I mean, you guys are phenomenal. One of the things Linnell Briggs is one of the best leaders I have ever come across. She was extraordinary. And I thought, I've always said to her, you better get onto the corporate board quickly. We desperately need you. And so remember that it's mutual, and we can teach each other. And the other thing I'd add is I've got a career I spent time as a consultant. I've spent time in the NGO, the non-government organizations. I got to spend time in the export finance corporations, which was fascinating. And I spent time in private sector. Don't limit your career to just government. I should say just, but it's fascinating. But see if you can spend some time, or at least make colleagues, meet them across the sector, and you can read all the academic papers and the Harvard Business Review, but go and meet people in the different sectors. You've learned a lot.
Thanks, Rachel. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I just wanted to say a couple of things about particularly what John was saying about escalation. The tax office has had its fair share of, how could I say it? I won't say disasters, but things that have detracted from our change journey. We've had, a big scandal around one of our most senior people with the Plutus payroll. We've had the Four Corners story. We've had a massive outage. Just 3 things in the last few years. We have been on a change journey. It's been very successful. But what I was going to say about those things was that all of them, when you dug underneath what really had happened, and I was saying this to John earlier, it absolutely wasn't about not having processes and policies and strategies in place. What it actually came down to was our culture, and a culture of not challenging constructively, I should say, and not escalating. And when we looked back and we really dug deep, I can remember on one of those occasions ringing Commissioner Jordan, and he had been at estimates and he'd said all these things because he'd been briefed up the line, this, and this is true, these are the facts. And I can remember ringing him and saying, I'm really sorry to be the person with the bad news, but in fact that's not correct and you're going to have to go and change it. And it wasn't correct because it wasn't that people didn't know, it was they didn't want to escalate it because we had such a hierarchical culture and people were scared. I think that's the word I would use to raise it. And the irony of it was that he actually wanted people to escalate and constructively challenge. So in our culture journey, we have made massive inroads, and it's 7 years now, our journey. So again, I'm with John. I think 10 years probably is about when you get there. But when we did an assessment of our culture, we found there were 3 or 4 still really sticky, difficult cultural traits that we were really trying to break through. And one of them was around this constructive challenging and feeling comfortable to escalate things when you couldn't resolve it. And so we're still working on that, and that is, you know, part of the next 3 years. Hopefully we'll crack it. But I think, you know, that's something that's really important, that escalation piece that John talked about. Anyway, I'll hand back to you now, Rachel, because I think we're probably running out of time here.
Might be just time for one or two more questions. I think colleagues in the room and at different sites across Australia, you know, are keen to explore what more they can do to build their own capability. So perhaps the panel could just address that question. You know, what's the most important skill for HR professionals today, and perhaps where, Jackie, do you see the sort of biggest capability gaps, if you wouldn't mind addressing those couple?
Well, I asked Ari this morning because they've been doing lots of work and people have been going through the accreditation process, and I said, well, where are you seeing the gaps? You know, like, can you tell us? Because actually we have got anecdotal evidence around where the gaps are, and I've been out talking to lots of the COOs and the secretaries. People say, you know, workforce planning, we're not really very good at workforce planning. Policy, you know, a lot of people are saying that there's some gaps in employment policy. People are saying we're really good at diversity, and then I talk to the people who are involved in diversity, they're telling me our numbers are going backwards. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure where the biggest capability gap is, but what I would say is that we need to continue to learn and take on new skills and develop, and a lot of that is in our own hands. Agencies and support areas can only do so much to encourage people in their development. People have to actually go out there and do some of this for themselves. I'll make a plug for ARI. I think it is important that we get on board with our professional association. I think it is important that we get our people going through the accreditation pathway. But equally, I think qualifications from universities and tertiary providers is just as important, as is experience. And the thing that I'd say that perhaps, and it was an article, a colleague of mine sent me something and it really resonated with me. They had gone out and talked to a lot of CEOs around different industries, and they said what they felt that HR was lacking was business acumen and a commercial sort of mentality that they were bringing to things. So maybe that's where we need to focus. But I think there's a whole load of areas that we can lift our game, as can any profession.
I mean, I think being able to have a conversation with someone who's running a piece of your organisation and have that as a meaningful two-way dialogue is one of the most important skills that you can have, because it's the platform for everything else. It's where your credibility is established. It's where your curiosity is established. It's where you start understanding where the problems are. So those, and I don't mean you can call it stakeholder management, influencing. I'm talking about just being able to have a conversation which is about the business of the day. And I think the only way you can get better at that is to do them. Right? And be upfront, explain why you're doing it, right? But that would be for me, if you can get that right, then people they stop saying that you don't have any business acumen, right? Honestly, I've worked with some people who haven't got any business acumen and they're not in HR. So,
Well, listening to both of you, I'm struck by, I don't know when it came out, but possibly in the 90s, David Meister wrote a book called Trusted Advisor, which is well worth skimming through at least. And he has an equation for the trust that people have with anyone. So the trust that people have for me as an HR person has got an equation, and the numerator starts with credibility. That's the first part of the numerator, and credibility can be established in many ways. It surely, absolutely can be established in technical training, but it can also be established, as John said. The next component is reliability, which talks to our operational ability. If we're not reliably delivering services, forget it. We're out of trust. And then the third component on the numerator is, it's a weird word, but intimacy. Like, how much do we actually know people? How much do we really understand? And the denominator is an interesting one too, because how it's divided by how selfish we are, how we're looking at only our function, or we're looking at only our organization, and the more that selfishness goes up, the lower the trust goes in. So it's interesting, and as you think about that, how do you strengthen each of those components to gain trust in the organization?
I understand we've got time for one more question, so I will just pose this one to you, Jackie, if you don't mind, because a lot of colleagues are interested in how they can collaborate together as HR professionals across the APS. So where do you see the sort of key areas, perhaps in your capacity as head of the profession? How can we work together best?
Oh, well, the first thing is to join the HR network and to get on board with the professional stream, because unless we're sharing our knowledge and what we're doing, and there are many mechanisms for doing that, but just being here today, just being in the events today, reading the newsletters, reading what's going on around the organisation, talking. I can't, go past John's thing about sitting down, having conversations with people. You should be putting a lot of effort into that, because that really does form the basis of these relationships, trusting relationships where you can actually work together and collaborate. And unless you've established that from the get-go, you're not going to be able to do anything collaboratively or collegiately across the service. So I do think that's important. I recently went on a training program, still doing training, always keeping on trying to do new stuff and learning new stuff. And they gave us an exercise, and I thought, this is going to be rubbish, some sort of like basic exercise. You had to map out all of your networks, and you had to map out which ones what role they played in your network, whether you were giving more to them or receiving more, etc. And anyway, it was the most extraordinary exercise I've done, because I looked at it, and I sat back and looked at it, I had to discuss it with a colleague, and then I suddenly realised how some of the relationships were really working for me and were really productive relationships, and I was working with them backwards. But some of the relationships just didn't exist, and they were really critical to my role, and I needed to have those relationships. So even like breaking things down into some sort of simple approaches where you go, okay, I know this sounds strange, I'm going to map all this out, but actually it's pretty useful to see where your connections are. And I think, that is a very important thing, to have great networks and great relationships with people. And the newsletter, there's a little article from one of our colleagues at DHS, and she's written all about this and the importance of this in the recent MOG changes that have just occurred, and how it's really helped. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, I'm really thrilled that we have this opportunity this afternoon to do some of that networking and to meet with colleagues from other HR departments from around the APS. We might therefore wrap up in order that we can spend the most time together sharing a cup of tea in the next room, and I know that colleagues around Australia will also be taking this opportunity to network and spend time together. Thank you so much to the panel. It's been really wonderful to hear from you, and we've learnt a lot from this afternoon's conversation, especially around the importance of engagement with business, how HR people are problem solvers, that we can help other corporate areas in the department to drive change, and how critical a role we play in doing that. So thank you so much for your time. Colleagues, this is the first of many events that we're going to be running through the APS HR Professional Stream. Our Strategic Leader Speaker Series will see us be joined by colleagues such as those on the panel today, both from public and private sector. They're going to be advertised through GovTeams and through the newsletter that Jackie referred to. So please make sure that you're signed up to those things. I'm really pleased to say that today's event is worth 2 CPD points to maintain your RE HR certification and professional membership. So it's absolutely worth coming along also for that reason. And more information about how to update your points will be sent to you after today's event. I'd also just like to take this final opportunity to update you on implementation of the HR stream and strategy. Pleased to say that 31 HR graduates started with APS agencies, 20 APS agencies over recent weeks, and they are participating in a 2020 pilot, which has been organised and run by Jackie's team, and the view there is to streamline HR graduates, help them network and build those core skills. So DFAT's really pleased to be part of that program, and 2 of our graduates with HR backgrounds will be participating in that pilot. We also now have visibility of the SES and EL2s in key HR roles across government. That's really important to know who's out there and what skill set they have. And Jackie will be running a series of town hall meetings to get out there and talk to HR professionals around the country. We were certainly very privileged to have her come to talk to our HR team recently at DFAT. So please keep your eye out for those opportunities as well. So I'd like to now invite you to join us for afternoon tea, mingle with colleagues and get to know each other, and thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.